Hi, my name is Oli Yamada, and I am doing my presentation on the Mexico hurricanes, focusing on Hurricane Manuel and Hurricane Ingrid. So on September 12, 2013, a low-pressure system in the Gulf of Mexico broke apart and spawned two storms, um, one heading towards the east coast of Mexico called Hurricane Ingrid, and one going towards the western coast of Mexico called Hurricane Manuel. So on September 15, 2013, as Manuel made landfall, it was a Category 1 hurricane. It was expected that it was going to lose its strength as it broke up and hit landfall, as most storms do, but Manuel had a special circumstance that it actually started to hit landfall and generate higher speeds, which made it a strong Category 1 hurricane. Wind speeds were at about 50 to 55 miles per hour. Average rainfall was 2 inches per hour, and in some areas they received 14 to 22 inches of rain. And this just spanned like a couple of hour period. Simultaneously, at the same time, on the east coast of Mexico, Hurricane Ingrid made landfall as well, sometime around the early morning of the 16th. It traveled along the eastern coast with winds at about 65 miles per hour, with 15 inches of rain in the major cities and 25 inches of rainfall in mountain cities. This isn't the first time Mexico experienced this double whammy effect, which they consider getting whacked from both the east and west coast at the same time. The last time this happened was back in 1958. Some of the destruction that occurred due to the heavy rainfall and the winds were landslides. Receiving this much rainfall in some of these areas of Mexico is very unusual, as some places don't even receive the 14 to 22 inches annually, and they received it all within a period of a few hours. This resulted in large landslides, taking off hills, surrounding areas that have higher topography, and completely just obliterating the hillsides. The excessive rain took the debris from the landslides and created mudslides, which ended up covering properties, as you see in one of these pictures below, devastating towns, property, people. And in cities that had better infrastructure and not that much access to hills and muddy sides, there was heavy flooding. So some of the destruction statistics from the simultaneous hurricane destruction was that thousands of homes were destroyed or covered. They were completely obliterated by landslides or mudslides. As you can see in the lower picture, they were completely covered. Some houses you couldn't even tell where they stood at one point. 20 highways or parts of major highways were covered or destroyed. 12 major bridges that allowed access from outer limit towns into bigger towns, or that connected large cities to other large cities, were completely destroyed and restricted access from the people who lived there to get to places that were receiving aid. Over 40,000 tourists were stranded in major resort cities such as Acapulco. They received damaging effects of roadways that restricted their access from leaving the hotels or leaving the resort areas. Shelters were unprepared for this kind of devastation. There weren't enough of them, and there weren't enough space to provide shelter for all the people who were displaced. After the storm, the reported count of deaths was 80 people, but those were only statistics received in major cities or from people that were accounted in these statistical surveys. So the economic disproportion, as in all storms or as in all parts of the world, we see that there are always a group of people that receive the brunt of the problem from natural disasters. So in the case of these two hurricanes, the tourists in the resort cities were the first to receive assistance. They were unable to get to the airports because the airports were flooded out, or that the roadways would restrict their access to get to the airports. So they were finding ways to get them either helicoptered in or with smaller planes that could land in these disrupted areas, took them to airstrips where they received military assistance, airplane assistance that got them out of the hazard zone, the danger zone, and took them to places where they could then receive aid or get their way back to wherever they came from. Most citizens in the major cities, it took them 2 to 4 days to receive aid. This was because they took care of the tourists first, and then they were getting to the places that had access. So that 2 to 4 day window was like the mean amount of time for citizens in major cities to get aid. So geographically, low-income people are kind of pushed out to the margins, and they are normally places that other people don't want to live. Either it's a access to resources, or it's unsafe land or undeveloped land that other people won't necessarily take a risk on. That was exactly the case in this scenario, where the poorer population were actually located within these steep hill systems. So when the heavy rains happened, it funneled the rainwater into these valleys and ended up flooding them out, creating large landslides and mudslides that went through homes and went through property and everything, and just took everything out. Most of these homes in the lower income areas were made out of cinder block, and they weren't mortared right because they weren't prepared for this kind of disaster. So as the landslides and the mudslides came through, they just obliterated the homes completely. In low-lying areas where the lower income people lived, banks flooded over, or water sources filled up and ended up sweeping outward, taking the homes and the people in the surrounding areas with them. It left about 23,000 homes without basic resources such as electric, water, dry supplies, food, all of the necessary things they needed to live, or even roofs to protect them from the rain. Looting happened. The authority or policemen or any sort of authority were not present in the lower income areas. They were sent instead to protect resort areas or major cities from these same criminal acts. So looters were taking things, were taking vital resources from citizens in that area and restricting access to people who could either not afford them or not have the means to get them illegally. The death toll is unknown in these areas. A lot of people are not registered, kind of like how we have like a national census and they can kind of track about how many people are within a certain area. These other areas have lots of homeless, or have people who occupy a small shelter, but many of them do. So the numbers of survivors in those areas aren't very accurate. So because of that, those numbers are excluded from the death tolls because of the inaccuracy or the uncertainty of the amount of people that are actually missing or dead. Shelters were also not equipped for the populations that were being displaced. So food ran out in some shelters. Some shelters ran out of space. They weren't able to accommodate everybody that was coming in, whose homes or property got destroyed. There were no dry supplies such as clothes, blankets, toiletries. The necessary things for people to be warm and safe were not available. There was also no medical aid to be had. There were no nurses, no doctors, no first aid kits, no way for these people to receive help. And as it took 2 to 4 days in major cities to receive aid, it took about 7 days for poorer cities to get, if they even received any aid at all. So what has happened since, or what has Mexico learned from these hurricanes? Unfortunately, for them, they don't have the means through resources or through money to make these repairs to create better infrastructure. They can only focus their resources on major cities, government buildings, banks, those types of those type of infrastructure that are important to their government and their economy. In this picture, this is representative of a lot of the outlying cities outside of the major cities that they were unable to rebuild, or they were unable to help those community structures rebuild. So they find ways to band-aid the problem. So with this bridge, for instance, they created a rope effect that just gets people across so that they do have access to get to other major cities, or to get out of their current situations or places that that are uninhabitable or unable for them to live in again. As for the government doesn't offer any subsidies, and all these people who've lost homes, businesses, and such don't get compensated. Instead, that they're forced to move into other cities and, in essence, find a new life and a brand new beginning, if that's even possible, with the amount of displaced people that came out of this. So it's not always an easy fix once something like this happens, that people come in and they can rectify the situation or to help the country itself to rebuild. Unfortunately, in this case, many parts of Mexico have yet to rebuild, and they are mainly only focusing on, like I said, major cities and infrastructure that's important to the government and the economy and the workings of Mexico. Many people are still homeless, many people are still displaced, and it doesn't look like there's any solutions in the near future to fix that. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you.